Hi, I'm EAC Chairman Don Palmer, moderating the panel on the 2020 general election. This is a part of our video series on the lessons learned from the 2020 election and the different ways that Americans voted. We have two participants today. The first is Jay Phelps. He's the Director of Elections Modernization and Administration and Special Projects in the Indiana Secretary of State's office. He joined in 2021. Now, he was a former county clerk at Bartholomew County, Indiana. Now, one thing about Jay is he's one of the youngest clerks ever elected at 24 years of age as the clerk of Bartholomew County in 2014. Since then, he served as the president of the Association of Clerks of the Circuit Courts in Indiana. He was voted by his peers as the 2020 Association of Indiana Counties Clerk of the Year. Our next panelist is Cynthia Willingham, Supervisor of Elections of Rockdale County, Georgia. And as Supervisor of Elections, she is responsible for administrating all the elections pertaining to federal, state, and county elections held in Rockdale County. Now, she has more than 20 years of elections and voter registration experience, and she has a bachelor's degree in business management. Thank you both for joining me today. I really appreciate you giving your time for this discussion. I guess my first question is, I think this election will be known as the pandemic election, because obviously this was such a major part of what happened in 2020 and how we adjusted. How did the pandemic affect voting generally, the early voting, mail absentee, and election day for your jurisdiction? And what were some of the significant changes that you made as a response to the pandemic? And we can start with you, Jay.
Well, thank you, Chairman, for having me. It is an honor. Anytime we can talk elections, I am there. So thanks again, Cynthia. Very nice to meet you, and look forward to our discussion today. Just like the rest of the country, we rang in January of 2020 thinking of our New Year's resolutions, and we never would have imagined the scope and the size of the pandemic. And of course, when we saw the devastating effects in March and April, as county clerk and as charge of the election process in my county, we knew that we had to get to work right away with how we were going to be able to pull this election off safely and still make sure that every voice was going to be heard. And so one of the first things that kind of happened as a result of the pandemic was the state ended up moving our primary back a month. So our primary was going to be the May 3rd and being moved back to June 2nd, which gave counties more time to prepare and plan. And then just in general, we could understand the virus more at that point. So what we did on the local level is we knew that we had to just to develop just a very easy standard process on how many voters could vote by mail, because a lot of voters, they vote in person, they vote on election day, early in person or on election day, but in my county anyway, very few voted by mail. So I wanted to just do a re-education process on what the options were, what the deadlines were, how to safely be able to do that. And so that was kind of the first step. So we really did a marketing campaign with all the media, sent out to all of our 300 or 400 county employees, just on how that process would work. And then we knew we had to contact our our polling places to see if they would even be willing to be a location on election day. And of course, there were some that weren't comfortable. So we did scale back the number of election day locations. However, our county courthouse was shut down to the public, and in the past, that's where we had absentee in person for 28 days before the election. So then we ended up putting our heads together. I contacted our city, and they had just purchased basically a former shopping mall that sat idle, vacant in the middle of Columbus, Indiana, which is the seat of Bartholomew County. And so from there, we worked out a contract, and we were able to vote for 28 days. It was an amazing location, centralized. And we set it up to where for early in-person voting for those 28 days, to where social distancing markers, plenty of PPE gear throughout the entire facility. And then we ended up hiring about 4 extra poll workers just to do nothing but sanitize. sanitize the voting equipment, the electronic poll books, the tables, the doors, making sure that voters were staying, spread out. We couldn't enforce our mask mandate that Indiana had during voting, but we just highly recommended that all voters would just wear masks for, personal protection. And so the great part about that was, we were able to translate a lot of what we did in the primary to the general election, which worked out very, very well. We saw a record number of voters vote by mail in the primary of, we're a county that has about 54,000 registered voters and nearly 7,000 cast their ballot by absentee by mail, which normally, that numbers in a primary is maybe 600 or 700. So an exponential increase. And so then we knew on the staffing side that we had to get more absentee voter boards to be able to process those ballots and to be able to go through those so we could count them at an adequate time on election day and still get results out to candidates in a timely manner. So overall, the system worked really well. Fast forward to November, the most amazing thing, we saw the pandemic shift, where in the summertime, the virus numbers went down briefly. And so we saw less voting by mail in November. And a matter of fact, that shopping mall I was talking about, that we saw over 20,000 voters show up and vote there for those 28 days before the election, which was just, of course, it was a record for just one location in the history of our county. But it also made election day much, much easier for us because we're a vote center county, meaning you can vote at any location because every voting machine has your precinct ballot programmed on that machine. And so we saw about nearly 21,000 vote early before election day in person. We saw about 6,000 vote on election day in person, and then about another 6,000 to 7,000 votes by mail in the general election. So overall, went very smooth. A lot of organization, a lot of work. The Secretary of State's office was able to procure, more than enough PPE gear for all 92 counties, and that's really what kind of gave us the confidence to be able to pull off in-person voting, both in the absentee and on election day. So very, very thankful for that.
Mall voting usually is considered large enough of a polling place in most cases. So Supervisor Willingham, tell me a little bit about what and how Rockdale County handled voting in a pandemic, both early voting, vote by mail, and election day.
Rockdale County, we have an average total of about 69,000 voters. For our primary elections, we usually have between a 5 to 8% turnout. And for our general elections, we usually, especially in the presidential year, we usually hit around the 72% turnout mark. Come 2020, we had two things going on. First of all, we were implementing a new voting system. From the new voting system, we also was faced with the pandemic. So for Georgia, our presidential primary was scheduled in March. The presidential primary election, because of COVID, had to be moved to June. It was first moved to May 19th, which would have been our general local primary election. However, our local primary election was changed from May 19th to June 9th. So our presidential primary and our local primary was held on June 9th. And as you know, between that time, our COVID cases were continuing to rise. This was a first for any generation for the state of Georgia and around the U.S., around the world. No one knew exactly what to do. So as the numbers continued to increase, the Secretary of State took the lead for us. And the first thing that we found out was that the state was going to mail ballots to all voters that requested a mail ballot, meaning that you submitted an application. There was a cutoff period on when the state would mail the ballot for you. That was huge for every county in the state, because as the COVID numbers continued to grow, so did the request for mail ballots, and people were vote early nor vote on election day in person. We, for Rockdale County, the highest number of absentee mail ballots that we've issued prior to 2020 was 3,500 ballots, and we thought that was a lot. However, 2020, we issued a total of 35,000 mail ballots. So that was big. The state mailed the bulk of those for us. However, think about with my staff, we only have 7 people in the office. And those 35,000 ballots coming back, we received majority of those ballots back. And so we had to bring in additional staff. We worked with our county commissioners for additional funding, but it was so hard to keep up because 2 things happened. One, the state implemented a process for voters to be able to request their ballots online. When you requested that, they had a portal. If you have a Georgia driver's license, Georgia ID, you can make that request online. The downside to that is that we never received an absentee application, so there was nothing for us to verify that voter by, other than understanding that the only way that that voter could access that portal was that they had a Georgia ID or a Georgia driver's license. So the key to that was working with your staff to make sure that, yes, we issued the ballot, but when this ballot comes back, you must verify the signature on the voter registration application to the signature on the absentee envelope, where before it was a 3-way match. You verify the signature on the absentee application, on the the voter registration application, and on the absentee ballot envelope. Well, the 3-way match went away and it became a 2-way match. Within that process, we had challenges by the parties. We had challenges from several of the political organizations that said this is fraud. You all should not validate a ballot if you cannot verify the signature. You should not mail the ballot to the voter. However, a decision was made that we needed to make sure that before you counted and accepted that ballot, that you verified this, you compared the signature to the absentee envelope to the voter registration application. And I'm sure you all have heard about all the challenges that Georgia received in ballots that were accepted in reviewing the envelopes. We work very closely with the state of Georgia, and each day we had to come up with new things. For me, we had to come up with a process of how do you now process these ballots back in, prepare these ballots for early tabulation. That was another process put in, because if you think about it, if you don't start an early processing before election day, you're going to be all night and 3 days, 4 days later after the election trying to count ballots. The state election board allowed us 2 weeks prior to the election to be able to validate the ballots, open those ballots, and scan those ballots. Meaning that come election day, the only thing we needed to do was pull those results over electronically into our tabulation center and generate the results. That was a very good decision. Election night, definitely for the general election, by 9:30, I was at home. The process was done, so we were so thankful for that. But when you think about in-person voting, we had challenges of voters not wanting to wear masks. That was the biggest challenge, and you could not refuse those voters. So we set up a area separate from the rest of the voters. And if you refused to wear a mask, then you went right rather than left. And we had a couple voting units for those voters, and they did not interact with the regular voters. Some voters did not like that. They felt that they were being singled out, but we told them that we're not going to deny your right to vote. We had challenges throughout with that. Throughout the process, we have 11 workers, including myself, to contract COVID. We had one death of a worker that contracted COVID. She was one of my early voting workers. And early on, she contracted COVID, even with all of the PPE supplies, masks. And I can tell you, my workers wore double masks. They had the regular mask on, they had the shields. We had sanitized everything. But I think the key thing that we all have to realize is that none of us knew enough about COVID, and we could only follow the guidelines that were given to us. So we can look back now and say, lesson learned. I hope that we don't have to deal with this again. But I can say for the in-person voting, our numbers were about the same as what they have always been. We did not have it was the third highest in our county of 26,000 early voting voters. That was the norm. What was not the norm was the influx in the mail balloting. So come election day, it was extremely quiet. It was extremely quiet, and we only had 6,000 people to vote during the entire year during the pandemic. So on election day, so election day was just extremely quiet. It was a quiet day. We didn't have any equipment problems. And as I stated, we implemented a new voting system in March of 2020. We used it for the first time, my poll workers, June 9th of 2020, to prepare every manager for election day. We're using the new equipment. Every manager worked for 17 days in early voting with the new equipment. So my managers and my assistant managers worked every day, and we require our clerks to work at least 2 days of early voting. That way, come election day, they were so familiar with the system that they were prepared. We had our IT staff in every precinct that we trained on the voting system also. So they were there as backup, and that was just that one comfy feeling for the poll workers because they knew exactly what to do. So we went from touchscreen DRE system, and we went with a ballot printing system, meaning that it generated the ballot for the voter, and the voter actually had the opportunity to review their ballot and feed it through a scanner. What the challenge we had there was that it was too many moving parts. I'm not sure if you all know that we now have the Dominion system. With the Dominion system, you have a touchscreen voting unit, you have a printer, you have a UPS, Universal Power Supply, and you also have a scanner. Whereas with the previous system, all you had was the DRE unit. So this was a lot, and we knew that we had to prepare those workers, otherwise you were going to lose them. So we had to keep a positive attitude about the system. None of my workers quit. We did not have any challenges on getting poll workers. We have 16 precincts in the county. We did not have any challenges of getting poll workers to work in the precinct. The state assisted us by assisting us with recruiting new workers through the party, several organizations. However, we did not have to go to that list, and that's just Rockdale, but several other counties, and talking with them, that was a blessing for them to recruit from the list that was provided to the counties from the state. But for Rockdale, we did not. We had dedicated, committed workers, and we all knew that it was a possibility that you could contract COVID. We did all that we could to make sure that we practiced all the safety guidelines, and we made it through. Now, if I had to look back and remember a whole lot from 2020, I don't. because every day was different, and we talk about this all the time. Like, I don't remember that. I don't remember doing that. How did we do that? But we made it. It was just teamwork that got through.
So shifting to in-person voting, what issues did you have, Mr. Phelps, on recruiting poll workers or finding locations? You mentioned a little bit in your opening comments. What worked and what didn't in addressing those issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in the presidential primary, we did have a difficult time trying to find poll workers. As you could imagine, I'm sure this is the case in a lot of states, but in Indiana, the average age of a poll worker is 72 years of age. And so, with the virus, we want to keep as many people as safe as possible. And so we look to, our high schools and the local college universities for some extra help, and did what we could. And we really only reduced a few in-person locations, which was great. Kind of something that I didn't think we were going to be able to pull off. And then come November, through I think a nationwide effort through Facebook and several civic organizations, we were inundated with emails saying, "Hey, I want to work the polls." And so different organizations, Facebook, I think even would prompt you, "Hey, sign up to be a poll worker today." And so we had to turn, 50, 60 people away, which was a great problem to have, because, normally we're running up against the clock to try to fill those last minute poll worker vacancies. So, one of the key, things that we do did in Bartholomew County is we take poll worker training very seriously. I mean, as an election administrator, as a clerk, we could have everything planned and organized to a T, but if our poll workers aren't well trained, all that work can go to waste. And so we do individualized trainings broken down by position, sometimes locations. And that's more work for us on the front end during our busy election season, but on the back end, it makes election day go much more smoothly when you have well-educated poll workers who understand the process. And so the training aspect with COVID was difficult, trying to keep everyone spaced out. So we had to have even more trainings than what we normally would have. And so, of course, we made the social distancing, the CDC guidelines, we followed them, and just did the very best we could, because we knew that we still had to pull off an election. And so the primary went very well with the in-person voting and the kind of that test that I talked about earlier with the mall location. In November, we I was just really thankful that we had so many people in our community reach out and say, "How can we help? We know that you're all on the front lines, and can I be a poll worker? Can I bring food? Can I do whatever and package it up safely and go to Walmart and buy box lunches or whatever?" And so it was just it was a great community feel. A lot of people stepped up and stepped in. Both parties were awesome to work with. They always have been. And so one thing I'm probably the most proud of is that location I was telling you about, where we had over 20,000 people. I think the longest wait time was about 20 minutes at most. And so that was something that, again, we kept adding we kept adding voting machines. So, with the mall that size, I think we started with maybe 6 or 7, and then we got up to about 14 voting machines. And we also have what's VVPATs, of voter verifiable paper audit trails, that go along with our voting machines. And so we kept running out of the paper rolls on those. And so we, rather than having to have both parties present to open them up and change out the paper, we just replaced the VVPATs and kept that all sealed and locked away in a secure location. And so it was a lot of hands-on, effort by myself, my staff, definitely a team effort. And the poll workers, I mean, they put themselves out. So many that worked in the primary said, "I want to do it again." I'm ready to go. I'll mask up. I'll continue to do what I can to make sure that this election gets pulled off. So very just grateful for that spirit of the American spirit of, hey, we this is important. This is our civic responsibility. This is our democratic process, and we want to see that it gets completed to fruition and with efficiency. And that's really what happened. I'm very pleased. I think Indiana overall experienced a very sound election. And that's just because we, with clerks and election administrators, we have a very tight bond. We communicate, email. Even though we couldn't have in-person conferences, we still would pick up the phone and, hey, what is your county doing? Kind of some best practices. And that really helped us get us through. And then just with the leadership, the Secretary of State's office, by procuring the PPE and giving us, because, we didn't know if election laws were going to be changed or, because of the pandemic. And so we just kind of had to wait and see the approach and continue to move as if we were going to have a normal election. And so for the general election, most of our standard election law stayed in place. There wasn't a change in dates. There wasn't a change in our absentee, by mail or in-person process. So that was helpful to know once we knew it. But overall, our poll workers, I always say that they're the backbone of American democracy. They are. They're the ones that are putting in the 13 to 14 hours. And a lot of folks, again, we had a new location this year where they voted voters 28 days before the election and with absentee in-person voting. And a lot of folks didn't. They worked the entire month. They did not want to leave. And so just that sacrifice and just willing to step up in a time of need. I just certainly appreciate it. And it really, I'm just very grateful.
So Jay, before I get Cynthia's input on Georgia in-person voting, well, did you, there was a lot of confusion. There were some changes that were made because of the pandemic. Did you see any increase in provisional ballots or technical issues with your voting machines? Or was that sort of par for the course? How would you characterize that?
We saw no changes with provisional ballots. We have, honestly, if we have 2 or 3 provisional ballots in our county, that's pretty standard. Other counties experience a lot, and we just we really never have. And we always want to make sure that our office is talking with the voter before the poll worker decides to pull that provisional ballot, because they could be registered in another county, and if there's time for them to go there, or it could have been an office mistake with a registration issue. So we try to investigate all those matters as much as possible beforehand. We really didn't experience any machine issues because again, we were just trying to be prepared and organized as much as possible, thinking through every worst case scenario and preparing for those. So there really wasn't any glitches. And as Cynthia alluded to earlier, we were home by probably around that same time, back 9:30 or 10, and then I turned on the TV and started watching other results from around the country. And yeah.
Yeah. Any lines of any sort of significance, or was that sort of reduced?
No, there wasn't any lines, and honestly, I'm very biased, but the vote center model, I just can't say enough about. I came in as election administrator in 2011 in Bartholomew County before being clerk in 15, and we had precinct voting in the presidential election of 2012, and then the midterm in 2014, and it was a disaster. There's just so many technological advances with vote centers, plus just the ease of access. I feel like it's more voter freedom and flexibility. You kind of vote by where you are, you don't vote by where you live. And I think that's huge. And that has always saved us with considerable amounts of lines. We went from a 2 to 3 hour wait time in 2012, which was which wasn't a very heavy turnout of an election, to a record-setting turnout in 2016 with 15 to 20-minute lines, and again, maybe 20-minute lines in 2020. So again, I think just being prepared and the vote center model really is the key to that.
So thank you, Jay. Cynthia, talk to me a little bit about the in-person voting in Georgia and how you saw the differences from this year. You did talk a little bit about the new machines that you had, the new systems. That's a significant transition. Talk to me about in-person voting and how it was different, and whether or not there were some areas that you had some issues.
Yeah. For Rockdale, as you stated, we implemented a new system, and the goal was to go out in public places and demonstrate this new system. And then the pandemic happened. So we're like, oh, Lord, how are we going to do this? Well, one unique thing about Rockdale was that in 2017, we had the opportunity, Rockdale was selected to be a pilot for a ballot marking device system. So in our November election, we did the sit-up Conyers election using a pilot system, which was a ballot marking system. That was the first introduction to a printed paper ballot for the voters that they could verify. The sit-up Conyers only have 7,000 voters in 2 voting precincts, but we took an advantage of that to have demonstration units set up for any of the other voters that came in that wasn't eligible to vote in the city election, but they can vote on the demonstration system. So that was a real issue for us, and we knew that looking back at 2017, the ease of those voters transitioning from a DRE to a BMD system, it was really easy. Voters loved having a piece of paper in their hand. So that's what we started to promote on social media and so forth once COVID happened and we couldn't go out in the public. The Secretary of State office also came up with this theme of secure your vote, or secure the vote. And there were all sorts of videos that showed you how to use the new system. Well, when our voters showed up the first day for early voting, we had lines everywhere. And we was like, oh gosh. We were thinking that not many voters would come because so many paper mail ballots had been requested. Many of the voters that requested the mail ballot decided, no, now I want to vote in person. So what that caused was long lines, because you now got to go through a process to cancel that mail ballot if it has not been returned and accepted, and allow this person to vote in person. So our lines extended to 45 minutes, sometime an hour, due to 2 things. We had to cancel ballots, but also what I didn't mention is we had 3 early voting sites for the very first time. We usually only have 1 early voting site. Well, our voters decided, I don't trust the other 2 sites. I know nothing about those early voting sites. This is my early voting center. This is where I vote, and this is where I'm going to vote. So we would say to them, well, it's going to take up to an hour. The average wait time right now is an hour. They took a seat, and they said, I don't care, I'm not going. And it was, the next site was only less than 10 minutes away. These voters refused to go to the 2 additional early voting sites. So we spent all this money, brought in all this staff, and on a daily basis, we voted less than 100 people at each of the additional sites. So I'm like, this is for you. So Cynthia decides, well, I'm going over to the early voting center, and which is our main, and I'm going to walk the parking lot before people get out their cars and talk to these people and say, you know, the wait time here is an hour. We have 2 additional sites. We had little notices that directed them on where to go. When I tell you these people had attitudes, they did not want to go to the new site. Will my vote count there? Yes, it's an additional site. So the trust wasn't there for the additional sites, and we made announcements throughout in our warehouse. We had a warehouse where voters could sit on the inside rather than be on the outside. And we did have inclement weather, but they could sit comfortably on the inside and wait their turn. Well, those voters patiently waited. They refused to go, and we made announcements. But what did speed the process up was 2 things that we did. Number 1, we inserted the sample ballot in every water bill. In advance. So the voters came with that sample ballot already marked. They knew how they wanted to vote. And then the second thing was that I had plenty of staff to process the voters, and when the most time would have been spent at the voting unit. So we brought in additional staff. We provided the sample ballots in advance. We had sample ballots in the warehouse while they waited. And so by the time that the voters reached the voting booth, it was a faster process for us. But however, you still had those ballots that needed to be canceled. Most of the voters didn't bring the ballots with them. that's fine, but we still have to cancel your ballot. You still have to sign this affidavit that you will not attempt to mail in that ballot that we mailed you. So that was a long process. We didn't vote. We didn't have a record turnout for early in-person voting. 26,000 voted early in November for the general election. It was just a standard for our June 9th election. But voters, they decided, I guess the numbers, they remain average, the COVID numbers, but the voters just decided, I don't want to trust mail. And I think part of that had to do with, we heard stories nationally about the delay in delivery of the ballots by the U.S. Postal Service. So that caused voters to not trust the mail. We also had ballot drop boxes at fire stations. So when we start to talk about mail ballots, and I'll go more into detail with that. But for the early voting side was just, people didn't want to go to the additional sites. I had staff, we had all this money. We received the grant, and I don't think I don't know if we'll get into talking about the CTCL grant that Georgia counties were, if you applied, you received. And I could tell you for Rockdale County, that saved us, because I used every bit of that money to bring in additional poll workers and to also give poll workers hazard pay. And, you know, they were happy. So they came back in November. But in-person voting,
So
it was okay. Just people didn't want to wear the mask, and we had a remedy for that. But outside of that, we were okay.
So, Jay, let's talk a little bit about the difference in voting by mail or absentee, if any, during the pandemic, and what you saw with the change in application process, the cure process, or the counting. Anything of note in Indiana that you saw of a change with that? Was there an increase for mail by voting in 2020? And what are your thoughts now looking back on 2020 and the absentee or mail voting process?
Yeah, so one of the major changes that the Secretary of State's office made very quickly was to allow voters to request an absentee application online. And when a voter did that, the county election administrator received that application, in real time, and be able to process that application and get a ballot to that voter same day. So that was very, very helpful. And still, being able to check all of the voting security procedures with that voter, connected with the BMV, connected with the Social Security office, and those type of things. So that was very, very helpful for our office. For the primary, it was a record-setting vote by mail election. Even more than a general election, a presidential general election. We've never seen that type of many ballots. And then, of course, in the presidential, we got a few hundred more than what we did in the primary. However, voters, I think at that time, just, I think, as Cynthia said, I mean, there was the post office issue and voters not trusting that. And so you kind of saw that shift back to voters voting in person once again, either earlier on election day. So we still had quite a bit of by mail votes, but not as many as what we were expecting. We saw that there were almost 7,000 in the primary, so we thought, well, maybe there'll be 10 or 12,000 in the presidential, but that never materialized. And we weren't complaining because with our system, it does take more time to count the absentee by mail ballots, and that's okay. We planned for that. We actually, our entire team counted all of our votes in one of our courtrooms, so we could all be spaced out and have enough absentee voter boards to count these ballots. Instead of just one or two, we had about 10. So that was also very helpful and allowed us to get through this unprecedented number, starting at 6 a.m. and wrapping up about 4 p.m. on election day, and still able to get those results out the earliest that we could release them by law, which was the absentee results, which was at 6 p.m. So when the polls closed in Indiana, overall, I think looking back at 2020, just the resiliency of the the Hoosiers, the Hoosier voters, and just the election administrators, the poll workers. I mean, everybody just kind of we were in this together. I mean, that was really this kind of the pandemic slogan, I think, and we certainly felt that just the amount of people that came together because we understood that there was still an election. We still had to have an election, and we still wanted to be sure that every voter who wanted to vote was able to do so. Probably the most challenging aspect, honestly, of the entire 2020 was just how do you vote those travel board folks who are confined in a nursing home, assisted living facility where COVID numbers were very, very high, where there were outbreaks, and in some cases you couldn't even you couldn't even get in the door. I mean, a family member couldn't even get in the door. So we had to have very creative ways, such as talking through a screen or a window, and pointing through a window on how a voter wanted to vote, and
Wow.
To be able to still pull that off and be in the legal parameters. So that was certainly interesting, and of course, just having all that, making phone calls and having a lot of that paperwork done ahead of time with the process as well. So overall, just very thankful for all the efforts in 2020 by our community, and I think everyone would probably agree that we never want to see anything like that ever again.
So then, Cynthia, tell me a little bit about, did you see an increase in mail-in voting during the 2020 election in Georgia? And how was that different due to the pandemic, if you could describe that? I mean, I think we generally know, but you're on the ground, and we'd love to hear about how that changed in 2020.
For Rockdale, the most absentee by mail ballots we issued was 3,500 prior to 2020. In 2020, we issued 35,000 mail balloting. And with a small staff, we definitely knew that we could not handle the mass numbers. However, the Secretary of State stepped in. They hired a vendor that mailed those ballots for us. So rather than the counties themselves having to go through to mail the bulk of the requests that we received, those ballots were mailed by the state. So the only thing that we had to do was have a process in place to receive those ballots back. So that worked out well for us. 2 weeks before the election was the cutoff. Therefore, anything after a defined date, it reverted to the counties to mail the ballots to the voters. We did have some problems where voters did not receive their ballots that were mailed by the state, and we had to reissue ballots and so forth. But that's the norm in mail ballots, and when you have that big of an increase in requests. To process those ballots back, we brought in additional staff to validate those ballots and to prepare those ballots for early tabulation. One of the processes that was approved was that the state election board approved for ballot drop boxes, as well as the state, for a county my size, they paid for one of our ballot drop boxes, and we received grant funds to purchase additional. For Rockdale County, we had a total of 8 ballot drop boxes around the county for voters to return the mail ballot. And for Rockdale, they were stationed at fire stations and at my main office. That was a big help for us because we were able to go to the drop boxes each day, retrieve those ballots and bring them back in and process those ballots. So we had very little contact with voters, which was a good thing on the mail side. One thing to point out is that our office never closed to the public. We never closed to the public. Our doors remained open. Where majority of the county was shut down, we showed up in person and our doors were open. We asked that people wear masks and so forth, but we did have a shield in between the voter and our workers so that we can assist the voters. I thought that we had a great plan in place. We worked with our postal service, which was the norm in all elections for us. We asked that our mail be held and we pick up the mail. And so every morning at 10, the postal service had our mail ready for us to process for that day and to pick up. So that was a plus for us too, without having to wait on the postal service to deliver the mail and try and process ballots. We actually would pick up our mail ourselves, and that gave us a head start on getting the day's mail processed in a timely fashion and getting the ballots out to the voters. So on the mail side, it was just a increase in numbers, but the other part that we had challenges on, and you probably heard about around the states, was the trust in validating those ballots and counting those ballots. The Secretary of State office allowed monitors to be able to come in to observe us opening those envelopes as well as feeding those ballots through the scanners. Well, some of the problems we had would be those monitors or observers would camp out at our office overnight because they're thinking we're coming back in the middle of the night and we're going to count ballots, and they not be present. So they were camped out at our office. They were camped out at ballot drop boxes, taking pictures of any person that brought back more than one ballot, which they call ballot harvesting. So complaints would be filed about that this person, we observed this person dropping in 5 ballots in the ballot drop box. Well, the law provides that you can return a ballot for your family member. And so if you're returning 5 ballots for people in your household, that was allowed. However, some of the observers, it became a big problem. They would show up at our office throughout the day, want to speak with us. They wanted us to give them numbers of how many ballots we received that day, how many we have ready for counting, how many have we issued that day. And all at the same time, we're in the middle of processing ballots back in and issuing ballots. And it was the constant interruption. And not only were they showing up, but they were also calling. We received phone calls all day about how quantifying what you had, how many cures do you have, how many provisionals do you have, and so forth. So those were the challenges for us.
So it really is a testament that your office never closed. And I think that is just huge as commitment to service of voters. Again, let's thinking back to the changes that we all had to do in 2020 in elections and with Indiana and Georgia. Do you believe these changes will continue, or were they temporary?
I do believe the change, it was temporary. As far as the increase in number of mail balloting that we had to deal with, I do believe that we will not see that big of a number again in the future. And I say that is because since 2020, we have not stopped conducting election. We had an election January 9th of 2021. We have one January 5th of 2021, February 9th, March 9th, and we just did another special election on June 15th involving candidates. And we saw the huge drop in mail ballots, and most of the people showed up in person on election day and during early voting. So I do believe that we will not see the numbers reach what we have seen in 2020, but I do believe we will see some increases.
So Jay, what do you think about Indiana? Some of these measures, are they temporary or will they continue for future elections?
Yeah, I think as far as like, allowing Indiana voters to request an absentee application online, I think that will be the case next year as well. I think that's just a great efficiency tool for voters to have at their fingertips. As far as the mail-in ballots, we kind of saw those numbers start to go down a little bit in the presidential election, and so I think Cynthia's right. I think voters will kind of go back to the way they've always voted pre-2020. And just as far as best practices, I think for us in Bartholomew County, I think the hope is never to vote at the courthouse again for several reasons. Courthouses are a couple hundred years old, and they're not voter friendly, less space, terrible parking. It's usually really a challenge just to get in the building in general, and so I think that's kind of a good measure to move that location permanently moving forward. And so I think other counties have also experienced that. But overall, I think Indiana, there's a few things we can carry on to other elections, and we'll probably still have some hand sanitizer at the poll just for good measure. I think that's a good practice. But overall, I think you're going to typically see a pretty normalized election pre-2020 moving forward.
So I think we have enough hand sanitizer for the next 25 years. So
that's right.
We're going to run out of that.
Yeah.
The last question for both of you is, what areas of improvement have you identified, during the 2020 election that you hope to work on and resolve as we approach 2022 and 2024? And Cynthia, why don't we start with you?
Well, let me say this. I have been doing elections for 32 years. I started in the largest county in the state of Georgia, that's Fulton County. And I left there in 2006 and came to Rockdale. And I think I've experienced everything prior to 2020 that you can experience. But 2020, I hope to never experience anything like that. But truth be told, things that we think we want to continue with in 2022, 2024, take state of Georgia for an example. Senate Bill 202 is the most popular bill in the world that Georgia has passed. Senate Bill 202 disenfranchises so many voters. And I have to say this. It has passed, it's been approved, we have to implement it, but prior to 2021, we had 8 ballot drop boxes that voters would be able to drop off their mail ballots. Senate Bill 202 comes along and reduces that to 1. And not only does this ballot drop box, you have 1 ballot drop box, the box now have to be on the inside of your building rather than the outside. Secondly, the ballot drop boxes can only be open during your early voting period, and it stops there. Where before, drop boxes were on the outside, they were secured by 24-hour surveillance cameras, and voters could drop their ballots off anytime in a ballot drop box around the county. Well, now that ballot drop box can either be in your office and or at one of your early voting sites. That's big for our voters. The other big change, when we talk about changes we can carry over, in my opinion, when you have legislation coming about that impacts all of that, you have to rewrite your script. So right now we're rewriting, because not only can we not use ballot drop boxes on the outside anymore, we have our legislators have totally redefined the absentee balloting process of voting by mail. It's no longer a signature verification. Now you include your driver's license, Georgia ID on the number on the application, or the last 4 digits of your Social Security number. If you don't have neither, then you include a utility bill, bank statement to validate whom you are. We can no longer initiate sending an absentee ballot application to any voter. The voter would have to initiate that request. So if you have not had an opportunity to review Senate Bill 202 for the state of Georgia, I have put a presentation together that I've been invited several places to talk about the impact of Senate Bill 202 on the voter. I would be happy to share that summary with you, but Senate Bill 202 actually defines what we do next. And we're now rewriting our script based on Senate Bill 202 requirements to say now what can we take forward to 2022 to improve the process for our voters as well as comply with the new requirements.
Jay, what areas of improvement have you identified to work on and resolve as you approach 2022 and 2024?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think given the circumstances, last year's election was phenomenal, really. However, in my new role with Secretary of State Holly Sullivan, one of the things that, I have a new clerk, right, in Bartholomew County that replaced me. And anytime that you get new leadership, I think it's very positive to have just a new voice and a fresh perspective on how things can be done better. And so I think for my new role here at the state is I would like to see more collaboration. I know the secretary does, and that's why I'm here, with state and local officials, clerks and county election administrators, just to give us more resources at our fingertips. I mean, the state did a great job. I'm not saying that, but as far as there was, litigation in courts on the absentee process, there was, the change of date with the primary. And so we weren't, we just felt kind of left in the dark a lot of times on the local level on how to proceed with different matters. And so, as far as the county election board, state law gives us a lot of, room to be able to, unanimously agree on certain facets of election law. And we had to do the best we could, with what we were given during the pandemic. But just that increase in collaboration with the state and local level, I think is huge. Because, again, the local level is where it's at. I mean, the clerks, the election administrators, the poll workers, they are implementing the elections, and they are on the ground. They are seeing, hearing, and working the long hours. And so we need to give them the resources they need to be able to succeed. So, that's just something that I think more communication is just, you can't beat that. And that's something I hope to see, just with the future of Indiana's elections. And, I can't stress it enough, just marketing your elections. I think that's so vital as well, because there's just so many different changes. I mean, not only with the pandemic, what happens if a candidate or an office holder passes away before the election, and just how are you going to get those words out to encourage voter turnout and any changes? And so, obviously using social media platforms, using your local media, and then, going out, going to your high schools, your universities, and your Rotaries and Lions clubs and all those different ones to be able to make sure voters feel confident in the voting experience, and they feel like they have a seat at the table, and that their vote matters and that it does count. And that's the most important thing, I think, that Cynthia and I, that we have, on our plates, that you have as well in your role, Don, and that we want to see across this country, that, we want folks to vote, and we truly want to make the process better. And that's why we're here. That's why we wake up in the morning and do what we do.
From you is communication with each other and communication with the voters. And I sincerely agree with that. That's absolutely correct. And I hate that will help build confidence in voters in their election process. So,
yeah.
Well, thank you both for joining me today. This is a series of lessons learned on the 2020 elections, and I want to thank you both for joining me today to talk about elections in Indiana and Georgia. Thank you very much.